Thank you for joining us on Heritage Events Live. We're delighted to welcome you to Revolutionary Technology for U.S. Dominance in Space. Please welcome our host, John J.V. Venable, Senior Research Fellow for Defense Policy at the Heritage Foundation. We hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you, Catherine, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to bring you into a panel with three incredible experts as we discuss revolutionary technology for U.S. dominance in space. As most of you know, space is a growingly contentious environment, and our dominance as a nation relies more and more on what is now an inseparable bond between civil, commercial, and military space programs. This morning, we'll explore the dynamics of emerging space technology and how we should foster the development of leading-edge capabilities from all three perspectives. And to have that discussion, we've got three strikingly handsome and wicked smart space experts with us this morning as they join us on screen now. And please do, gentlemen, let me tell you a little bit about them. Joe Lorente is the founder and CEO of Ursa Major, and is the definition of a rocket scientist. He actually designed, developed, and fielded several engines and spacecraft, including SpaceX's Dragon spacecraft, Merlin and Merlin D vacuum engines, and the BE-3 engine that rocketed Jeff Bezos into space yesterday in Blue Origin. I'm not sure if you got a thank you note from him, Joe, but you should have. He founded Ursa Major in 2015, and his company is on the leading edge of technical space solutions. His team has developed and tested America's first oxidizer-rich staged combustion engine, the Hadley engine, at two world-class test facilities. And he has a team that has grown to more than 100 employees to make that happen. Justin Johnson is a senior vice president at Meta Aerospace, a cutting-edge defense and space solutions that works ISR services and all the way down to multi-mission electromagnetic technologies. In the previous administration, Justin served as the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. He has served as the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Defense and as the Special Assistant to the Deputy Secretary of Defense as his lead for space issues. And in that role, he was the head of a working group that wrote the proposal that established the United States Space Force. And finally, the strikingly handsome Steve Rodriguez. He's the founder of One Defense, a strategic consulting firm that leverages machine learning and wargaming to accelerate non-traditional technology from the commercial sector into the Pentagon. He serves as a board director of or advisor of multiple high-end organizations, including the Atlantic Council and the Naval Postgraduate School. Steve is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and previously worked on the defense policy teams of the Romney and Jeb Bush presidential campaigns. And if you want to get him talking about special ops in his days as a younger man. For this morning's overview, just real briefly, I'll spend the first 30 minutes pelting these gentlemen with my questions, and then we'll see how well they respond to you all kicking them in the shin. So please take the time to go over the right side of that bottom panel over there of your screen and start typing in your questions now, and we'll pick them up on the fly. With that, why don't we dive in? Steve, my first question is to you. How should DC policymakers view the growing list of emerging space technology companies? Many of them seem to be so far out there that from an outsider's perspective, they would consider them science fiction. Could you talk a bit from an investor's point of view about the companies that are leading the charge, the things they're developing, and the technology's potential in our national defense strategy?
Well, JV, thank you very much for hosting the event, and thanks to Heritage Foundation for showing leadership on this type of thought leadership. It's great to be on a panel with so many friends as well. And I think to your question, it's important not to tie this to science fiction or to even pop culture, what we're dealing with, what we saw yesterday and last week, I believe, with Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin. But I think it's important to tie everything back to the national security strategy and what effects or benefits that government investment or private investment can leverage, at least sitting here in Washington, D.C., like Justin and myself and JVR. So with that being said, when we look at technology itself, space technology included, it's important to think about it in terms of one of three what we call waves in the investor community. And this is what I think a lot of people in the government miss is they'll see a high-end space technology company, get released through the Defense Innovation Unit, get funded through AFWERX, or they'll see it in pop culture, and they'll think, "Oh wow, think of all the wonderful things we could do with that technology." The problem is it really is a function of a building what we might call a space industrial base that can support those technologies as they emerge over the horizon. And think about it this way. Right now, we have a vibrant defense industrial base because of consistent government spending throughout the years, and also because we have major primes, the Lockheeds and Boeings and Raytheon, or I think now it's Raytheon Technologies of the world, that then manage these large programs and integrate what they call major service or major system providers that then integrate the small business contracting community, right? So in many ways, it's kind of a pyramid of contractors all supporting each other up to the top, where you have the major system integrators such as the ones I just mentioned. So the reason why I'm telling you all this is when you think about investing in new technologies in the space industry, it's important to think of that in the same through the same lens of analysis. So with that, you don't get an emerging space tech company, say brand new, right out of the garage or off the launch pad, without having a fully functioning and wholesome or fulsome space industrial base. And that includes the Blue Origins and Virgin Galactics and SpaceX's, and of course our friends at United Launch Alliance at the top of that pyramid as the new kind of space integrators. Then you layer in what you might call that's the first wave. Then you might have a second wave of the Ursa Majors and others that have launched several years ago and are now becoming increasingly well-funded. And only when they fully solidify and strengthen do you have an industrial base, a contracting base to support all these brand new small business innovative research awardees that you see in the news from AFWERX and through the Defense Innovation Unit. Without them, you are in effect creating a space industry that is totally reliant upon government spending and only government spending. And the problem is that's history and evidence has shown that's simply not enough to build out an industrial base that's going to get us Star Trek and Star Wars, depending on what side you're on.
No, completely agree. And I love your analogy with the pyramid, that this the technological spike that comes from the government and the infusion of funding. If you go back a couple of years, the Obama administration, when they canceled the moonshot and the rockets that were being developed to take us all the way to Mars, they promised an infusion of about $6 billion additional dollars. And over the course of the next 3 years, they actually reduced that by $6 billion. So a net $12 billion loss in thought. And so we have to be prepared, I think, to bring in funding for organizations like Joe's. And Joe's, from your perspective, how do policymakers make the Defense Department and the U.S. government as a whole a desirable customer for your innovation and companies like yours that are on the leading edge? In other words, how do they convey confidence, the genuine confidence required for investors to expend the time, effort, and capital required to develop products down a national defense path versus often sending them total commercial path?
Yeah, thanks, JV. This ties very well to Stephen's answer. We're seeing, everyone's probably seen the headlines that we're seeing more and more private investment into the space community. So it's imperative now more than ever that we find a way for the government to leverage that and to really steer these companies like ours and every other small space company that's on the market right now toward the end goals of the Department of Defense and other federal agencies. So for us, I think what we've seen is these organizations that Stephen mentioned, AFWERX, DIU, they've done a really good job at sparking the early interest of small companies. But these companies need to see a path toward larger production contracts, higher levels of monetization, because in reality, the competition of the federal government with these innovative companies is the investor base, the commercial market. So without the right signals, companies like ours steer more toward commercial and further away from the US government's incentives.
Right. And it would be natural that they would do that. So let me turn to Justin, because Justin, you just left the government, the Department of Defense, and now you're in the commercial sector. So your perspective here is really a great one. Not too long ago, if you'll remember, General Hyten, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said he was happy to allow the commercial sector to lead the way for facets of cutting-edge space technology for DoD and its development. How should we think about the role of space technology and the research, development, test, and evaluation hurdles required to bring it to fruition for the great power competition?
Thanks, JV. First off, I'm going to just echo what Steve and Joe have already hit on. But I think what I would like to do is turn that question around a little bit and say, let's compare our ecosystem, our national security space ecosystem, to what China's doing. Right, they've got a command economy, so they can run a plan all the way from the highest levels of PLA government down through commercial companies into developing, and it looks like there may have been another Chinese space plane tested in the last week or so. So they have this ability to control everything and move fast and knock down bureaucratic barriers, and they're doing it. I mean, I think you just look at what they've done over the last year. In space alone, it's really impressive, and it's. I think we should be concerned with what they're doing. That's not to say that's not how we should respond, right? We don't have a global command economy like that. We need to be instead focusing on how do we leverage, enhance, grow the innovation that's happening. I firmly believe that the U.S. space ecosystem can out-innovate the Chinese space ecosystem, but the gap that Joe and Steve have already mentioned is getting from that innovation into the hands of the Space Force or the NRO, Department of Defense, and it takes a holistic, big picture thinking from all the national leaders, national security space.
Well, fantastic. So I'm going to ride you a little bit harder here, Justin. The seed corn that goes into RDT&E very often comes from the commercial sector, but recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've actually seen some development that's come from NASA funding the RDT&E efforts of the commercial sector, like the CubeSat, Rendezvous and Proximity Operations, RPO, that will inevitably lead to Space Force employment. What does DoD need to do to accelerate the development of that leading edge technology? And with its track record, how much of that should be developed by DoD itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, first off, I think DoD, Space Force, NRO, they need to be clear about what they want, right? They need to articulate, here's what we're trying to do in space, here's the force structure we're trying to build, these are the capabilities we need to develop over time, to provide those clear signals to people like Joe who are innovating and thinking about hard problems. What are the hard problems that are Space Force unique or NRO unique? And then I think number two, I think the DoD needs to be clear about what they're, even maybe if not clear, at least working towards being clear about what are they going to buy, what are they going to rent, what do they want their allies to buy and rent? Are they going to? We don't buy rockets anymore. We rent, access to space. There are places, I think, where by the Space Force renting something, buying a service essentially, makes it easier for allies to bridge onto that capability as well. And then that sends a signal for the industry to go after and chase. So I think it's hard. Otherwise, Space Force and NRO would have already done this. But we created the Space Force for a reason, and one of those reasons is to provide more thought leadership and clarity about where we need to go as a country from a national security perspective in space.
Right, that rent or lease option, we are riding the backs of commercial launch But you're seeing that across several other different portfolios, like communications providers and the likes with Starlink, DoD now tapping into that commercial network of satellites, and others that are providing high-end resolution imagery, like ISI. Those companies really do provide a great service. But the question is, will that service be available to us when push comes to shove and we go to war? That's the question, and how will that go forward? Steve, I'll turn to you as an investor. What do you feel DoD misses when it comes to the intersection of military innovation and venture capital, especially when it comes to space technology?
Well, you could say it's okay to suck. It's what DoD does poorly is they at a programmatic level tend to suck. They just suck over a long period of time. And what I mean by that is when it comes to space, or even the early test, JV, you're a former Air Force officer and a pilot, if I remember correctly. The Air Force did the same thing. If you've ever seen The Right Stuff, they used to crash planes all the time. They lost dozens and dozens of test pilots. Same thing with the space industry. When Elon Musk went out there with the SN Falcon 9 and the SN series, and they were trying to perfect the belly flop landing, the way what we might call in the defense world the milestone A was all about failing and failing very, very quickly. But at the milestone A, in other words, in layman speak, very early on in the product development life cycle. Once you get beyond what we call milestone B, and I'm sure JV, you or Justin can comment more in depth about what that actually is from a programmatic perspective. Once you get beyond milestone B, you can lock in on the program and focus on tweaking the fine tuning the program you're working on. But before that, it's all about failing and failing very quickly, and that's precisely how the legend, I should add, of Elon Musk and SpaceX came about, because they failed and failed very, very quickly a number of times, almost to the point where it bankrupted Elon Musk. It's interesting, often in these venues, you'll hear people talk euphemistically about how we need more people like SpaceX and Elon Musk in order to have innovation in DoD. And I kind of scratch my head and I say, well, that doesn't really scale because you're basically relying on a billionaire coming down to his or her last check before they're bankrupt personally. So if that's your model for defense innovation, I would suggest you do more homework. From an investor's perspective, and to your point directly, JV, it's important to think about government and commercial investment dollars in terms of buying up or buying down types of risk. And this is an analogy I've used before, I've written about. When government R&D dollars are thrown at a problem, the question they're trying to ask with those greenbacks, right, with those dollars is, can I buy down technical risk with those SBIR or small business innovative research dollars? So when they're throwing money at a problem, they're trying to buy down the technical execution risk. In other words, if I put money against this, will it work or will it not work? Or will it work better with my dollars? The problem at the conferences and events like this, where you'll have someone from the government who writes those checks and an investor, on the same panel, is everyone nods and is like, oh yeah, we're talking about investment. And my response is no, we're not talking about the same thing at all. Because commercial investors throw money at a problem, not to figure out if the thing works or not. They're trying to figure out, if I give you my money, can you go from selling 10,000 units to 100,000 units more quickly than if I didn't give you any money at all, right? That's the basis for venture capital. That's called buying up market risk. In other words, is there a buyer for this or is there not a buyer for this? So you see the difference? Buying down technical risk, or does it work or does it not work, versus buying up market risk. Is there a buyer for this or is there not a buyer for this? So this is where I mentioned earlier, we talked about national strategy and even defense industrial based policy. This is where the government can help provide a coordinating function, right? You're never going to tell Andreessen Horowitz how to spend their money, but by providing a common level of understanding policy, you're actually able to help unify those types of risks that the dollars are being used to address.
So I love the answer. You know, if you go back and look at what happened to Musk, his first 3 launches were failures, and if the 4th one had been a failure, he'd have been out of business. And so this fail and fail early has a limit to it, doesn't it, Joe? When you are on the point of a company like yourself, what's the tolerance for investors like Steve to go in and go, oh, that's good, you failed again, Joe. That's great. Where do we go? Just 5 years ago, government space programs didn't attract many of investors. Turning that thought process on its head has allowed the U.S. to leverage private capital in early high-risk research and development phase of these companies, as Steve was talking about. How can we make government-facing startups more attractive to capital infusion from the private sector? Joe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think Stephen already helped me answer that. If you look back, as you said, 5 years ago, really the door that Elon helped break down was the risk tolerance, and particularly in aerospace, legacy aerospace, that the values or the virtues that you think about are reliability, low risk, really stable, steady growth, and venture capital and investors are looking for mega returns. They're looking for high risk posture, high level of innovation. So it's pretty contrasting. And I think what Elon showed was there's a route to these government buyers. If you look all the way back to that Falcon 1 Flight 4, there was interest from the Department of Defense, from the intelligence community, and obviously 2 or 3 years after that, they signed a large NASA contract as a company of 400 employees. So I think it's really important to continue to bridge that gap between the investor base and the ultimate customer here in the U.S. government by showing a bit of risk tolerance and building these programs in a way, and these companies in a way that they are incentivized to continue to innovate. And something Elon said a lot in those early days is he wanted to build a company, a hardware company that acted like a software company. They continually had better products. They were failing often, and ideally what that results in is a better product for the end user in the US government. So I think it's important to identify those areas and continue to invest there.
Fabulous. Justin, let me turn to you. How should the U.S. Space Force think about the role of commercial space from both a satellite launch perspective and a services perspective?
Yeah, thanks, JD. I mean, I think there's a bunch of things, obviously. It's not a simple problem. I think one of the challenges that they face is if you're a single program manager or you have a certain mission that you're responsible for the Space Force, ideally you want a competition with a couple providers that can scale, right? That can give you, whether it's SpaceX giving you 50, 60 launches a year, or someone else providing Maxar, providing EOIR from space at scale, right? And a lot of the innovation is happening small, right? So you've got a company with 50 people, 100 people, with a really cool idea, that you may have 100 of those small companies. And so for the Space Force, for the program manager, for the acquisition executive, that's the challenge. That's the challenge. How do you manage? You want that new tech, but you need to scale. And to get the new tech, you have to have a relationship with 100, hypothetically 100 companies. But in the end, you only want 1 or 2 to actually scale, because you can't manage 100 companies at scale, right? So in that tension, I think is where Space Force, again, I mean, not to be a broken record, but I do think there's they've got to think smart, because the U.S. space economy is, the Space Force won't exist, right? Won't survive, or at least won't thrive without a vibrant space economy here in the U.S. So it's in the Space Force's interest to encourage those hundreds of companies to grow, but they have to do it in a way that allows them to manage not hundreds of individual contracts, but less than that. I think that gets back to what I said earlier of, there's certain things you want to buy, there's certain things you want to rent, there's certain things you want your allies to buy or rent, and thinking through that on a mission basis, on a technology basis. And JB, like you said, there's different capabilities. You know, only uniformed folks should be in flight, right? And so companies don't want to be exposing their assets to that risk anymore. So trying to think your way through that, it's really hard, it's really complicated, but I think that's the key sort of set of issues that the Space Force and the NRO and everybody else needs to be working on.
Yeah, it's a fabulous and very fascinating time for space in the United States. If you go back to 1903, there was one aircraft manufacturer in the United States, really, the Wright brothers. By the end of the 20s, we had more than 24 fighter manufacturers, and now we're down to 2, and one major supplier of engines for our jets that are actually being purchased right now. And that company has a great deal of leverage over the government, over what we can buy and what kind of price they're going to give us for those. So it's really winnowing those down to where you can actually feed them business, that limited number of companies, but still keep the competition at foot where you're actually getting more and more for what you pay for. Challenging. Steve, this is a great area for you. DoD has provided seed capital and follow-on investment funding, SpaceX, Musk Starlink, and even foreign private companies like ICEYE for their imagery. While this gives the U.S. government access to the follow-on fielded technology in a free market, it will also give our peer competitors access to those same systems in a time of war. At a policy level, what agreements does the United States government need to strike with these civilian companies to ensure we have access to those assets for U.S. national security in a time of crisis?
I think first off, we have to start with industrial-based policy. So current national policy is characterized as protect and promote. In other words, certain technologies we need to be protecting, shielding from external market access, and especially external investment. Other technologies should be promoted. That means these are American technologies like a Ursa Major, you know, and dozens of other companies like them. Those should be promoted in terms of the government investing in them to maintain that enduring capability, to ensure that it's actually there when we need it. So I think it's important to think, setting that aside, right? So you have the national level policy out of the way. Okay, great, all set. The big challenge is we don't really know what we should be protecting or promoting. You'll have people say, oh, well, there's a classified annex somewhere. Well, there probably is, but it's rarely updated on a regular basis, and it's likely out of date, you know, every quarter based on the venture capital investing ecosystem alone, not because someone's not doing their job. They're just not able to do their job fast enough on an iterative basis to ensure that the list that we should be protecting and promoting is actually accurate. Once you move beyond that, though, you run into a dynamic that I think Joe and Justin were highlighting, and you know, we have some friends that we co-invest with, Seraphim Capital, that just did a massive SPAC based out of London. They're a heavy investor in space, to include ICEYE, I think that's what it's called. That's a synthetic aperture radar technology. I think when we think about government, you know, I'm sitting here in DC, so when we think about the government right outside these windows here, helping a company like some of the ones in Seraphim's portfolio, I think it's important to think about and kind of segment category, what we call in the venture world, category leaders by subsector. So what that means in practice is not every single technology, and I think DIU has done this fairly well, not every technology has to be kind of at the F-35 level of kind of major acquisition program scrutiny and rigor, which tends to correspond with those 20-year cycles to get that capability in the field. I think when you're talking about launch, and speaking of monopolies, the heavy launch market is a literal monopoly. That's why companies like Ursa and many others are trying to break that monopoly by moving up the value chain from the kind of low or light to medium to heavy thrust to actually give the government and the commercial sector optionality when it comes to getting these large rockets into space. But I think rockets are one thing, payloads and sensors might be a completely different thing. And you're much more likely to see compelling technology coming from overseas, coming from Israel, coming from the Middle East, coming from especially Europe in the kind of sensor and payload areas. And I think it's very, very important to take a nuanced acquisition view with those types of technologies, because you're not talking about building giant gas tanks, that are going to get fired in the low Earth orbit. You're talking about software technology. You're talking about sensor technology that should, I would argue personally, should have a lower threshold for acquisition scrutiny. I think one final thing is we want to think about our industry partner strategies as well. A lot of these companies don't either have the capital, nor do they have the interest, frankly, nor do they have the ability to get cleared and get on certain bases themselves, especially if they're coming from overseas. So then the question has to be, will you just tell them, hey, go pound sand? That's, my speak for it. Don't bother working with the US government, or do you try to think proactively about how you help them onshore into the US government market, working with, say, a major launch provider, a major system provider, like the ones we mentioned before. So I could go on all day about that, but I'll stop and maybe Justin or Joe have other comments there.
Yeah, that's great, Stephen. I think on the launch side particularly, you're right to separate launch from sensors and data acquisition on the on-orbit side, but I don't think it's a major change to acquisition policy. I think it's acknowledgement that the capabilities that we're looking to buy here in the US are going to change. And launch is a great example of that. We went from every satellite as a 20-year, really costly program, single satellite that you're going to put on orbit for a long time, to small satellites. These are things that need to launch more frequently, and you can take a bit more risk that technology needs to change quickly. So I think it's just continuing to assess what are the capabilities that we need as a nation, and who are the players that are likely to solve those problems, and how do we bring them into the fold if they aren't that F-35 level of maturity?
And I think the one other thing I would add, Stephen, is I really think we need to think about this not just from a US only perspective, but from an allied perspective, right? We've got some cool things going on in other countries that really should be part of the fold, and got to think about that holistically. And I think the other, just sort of to re-up something Joe mentioned earlier, but I think it's relevant to this part of the conversation, is sort of the Elon Musk quote about software versus hardware. Building a company that upgrades like software. DoD doesn't buy software very well, right? And so how do you? But I love the idea, right? How do you set up a system where Joe's company or whoever it is can say, we want to continually spiral the new technology in, not just sell you something that you own for a decade, right? And that's, just to close the loop on that, pushes you back towards leasing and renting as models versus just buying things. But that software mentality, I think, is really interesting, and what's driving a lot of the innovation in the private sector.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's obvious I've lost control of this conversation. These guys are all over the place. I want to ask you guys, they've handled all of my questions like they were softballs. So if you've got a tough question for these folks, please throw it into our system and type it into the window, and I'll get it right away. I've got one or two that are hanging right now that I'll hold off on for just one more minute. Joe, I kind of want to turn this same conversation back to you. As you know, we selected aircraft from the U.S. airline industry are contractually committed to augment the Department of Defense airlift requirements during emergencies. The program's called the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, or CRAF. From an entrepreneurial perspective, what would be an acceptable expectation for the space assets in a similar emergency? What would be reasonable?
That's really interesting. We've never really, as a nation, had a fleet or a hangar of rockets that can launch on a moment's notice should we need to replenish orbital assets. So I don't think that there's an equivalent today, but I think that the most important part there would be ensuring that we, as an industrial base, have the ability to assess any of those needs that might arise in an emergency. So if this is if we think we need to launch a large rocket, maybe a constellation on a moment's notice, we need to ensure that we have the ability to stand up and launch on a moment's notice. And there was a great example a few weeks back where a SpaceX launch was scrubbed because a small civilian aircraft flew within something like 50 miles of the launch pad. So it's going to be impossible to have an emergency reserve of capabilities without seriously assessing what are those needs that we need, what are those needs in times of crisis.
The number of launches that are taking place across the civilian sector are pretty enormous. I think SpaceX this year will launch something like 30 rockets into space on its own. So we're really nearing that point where we've got almost an on-demand launch capability. Justin, it looked like I cut you off. Were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to jump in. I think the what you're hitting at and what Joe's pointing towards is resilience, right? How do we, from a Space Force perspective, or from a national security perspective, what does a resilient space architecture look like? And then that's been one of those questions that comes up, repeatedly over time in the space ecosystem, and it's really hard, right? Because even if we have SpaceX launching every week, it takes time to integrate payloads onto those things. It's not as easy as just saying, hey, next week we're going to change what's on that rocket. But then you've got smaller providers, the Virgin Orbits, the Rocket Labs, folks like that, who are, can do things pretty quickly as well. But again, it comes back to Space Force has to make resilience a priority. They have to figure out how do they send a demand signal that industry can organize around. And I don't think that's as clear as it could be or needs to be to really drive resilience.
Steve, anything to add?
I think we do need to think. This is where earlier I mentioned this isn't sci-fi. Like, this is real world stuff that needs to be grounded in national security strategy. One kind of new way of thinking I'd like to put forward was, up until recently, firmly the thing or in the realm of sci-fi, and that is shifting our base of operation for getting stuff, for exploring space, getting stuff into space from terra firma, right, Earth, into low Earth orbit as the base for, frankly, space exploration. Throughout my life, I've always been kind of bothered when people would say, we need to get back to the moon, or we need to go to Mars. And I would always say, well, I guess, look, it's, that's cool and all, but why? Why spend an ungodly amount of money, even to get to Mars today? Like, it will require a stupendous amount of money to get to Mars. And for what? So we can be the first person on Mars. Okay, well, I'm all for national pride, but why would we do that? I would argue that companies like Ursa Major, companies like Varda and Hadrian, that are focused much more on additive manufacturing of complex materials, not just taking plastic polymers and making a little business card holder. Companies like Icon 3D as well now give us the opportunity to get out of basically the killer economic paradigm we're in now, which is where we basically spend 90% of the cost and the weight is just getting our butts off of terra firma and into low Earth orbit. So then it begs the question, why not move into low Earth orbit and then use that as the launching pad where you don't need an incredible amount of thrust? In low Earth orbit, the big challenge is actually deceleration. So you need fuel, not to go, do what Elon Musk does and have the little counter showing how fast you're going. It's all about how fast and how you can leverage physics to stop, because there's something to stop you in space. What is powerful though is there is strong evidence that using 3D manufacturing, using space capabilities to refine materials, water, carbon in space actually gives you the ability to truly establish bases of operation in low Earth orbit and further out into our solar system. So I think to shake things up a little bit, this is literally on our near-term horizon, this capability. So I think it's outstanding that we're getting 30 SpaceX launches a year now. That blows my mind. But what I'm really excited about is to what end? Great. At what point can we get critical mass up in the orbit, and then from orbit, then continue to explore versus this kind of up and back, up and back, up and back, up and back. It doesn't make sense economically, and it certainly doesn't make sense in terms of any kind of continuity of operation that will allow us to explore the stars.
JV, you're muted.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to the audience real quick. And Justin, this first question I'd like you to take on, if you would. Will the U.S. continue to have a monopoly on providing services by satellite, such as GPS, television, and telephone?
JV, thanks. Short answer is no, and we don't today, right? I mean, the U.S. GPS is the world's largest service, right? Billions of users around the globe. But we're not the only one. The Chinese have a system, Europeans have a system, the Russians have a system. So that it's more broadly called PNT, Precision Navigation and Timing. That's, we don't have the monopoly. On the other types of services you mentioned, that's already, those are all commercial, right? So it's companies, whether it's SpaceX or SES, or there's a bunch of these commercial space providers that are already up there in geosynchronous orbit, primarily providing services around the globe. And the DoD rents, SATCOM in the Middle East and around the world from companies like that. I'm not sure about the TV. I'm not sure if military, the military channel is over DoD satellites or commercial satellites, but obviously most of the commercial television or commercial.
Oh, fantastic answer. And I really enjoy the loss of those monopolies, because that means our portfolio is being diversified. Starlink is actually doing PNT right now in thought as a backup to GPS, which is a really good thing should we go to war. So let me go, Joe. How can the Department of Energy and the national labs work with companies like yours to make things happen?
That's a great question. We've seen the Department of Energy taking bigger leaps into space here, particularly around things like nuclear propulsion. So I think encouraging the Department of Energy to look at some of these earlier phase Department of Defense organizations, DIU, AFWERX, NavyX, or NavalX, these organizations that are able to quickly identify and seed capabilities within startups is a great starting point. We've talked a lot about how to get to these bigger programs and how do we move things past this valley of death that startups face. But starting with that early phase seed contract and really inciting capability at these companies that can show their investors demand from another organization within the US government, I think that'll be a big deal.
Anything to add, guys? All right, well, here is another question from the audience. Is it worrisome from a national security perspective if these private companies / billionaires are seeking broader commercialization of space rather than just supplying these capabilities to the government? Any thoughts? Justin?
I'll take a first go, but I mean, certainly I'd love to hear the other guys. I don't think so, right? I think I'm much more worried about what Russia and China are doing in space than what SpaceX or Blue Origin are doing. And candidly, SpaceX and Blue Origin are both contractors for the US government, right? So they have an incentive they're American companies, so they have an incentive to care about what America cares about. And part of their funding comes through the US government. So, sort of setting headlines aside, I think it's a net very positive thing for the US that these these companies, SpaceX, Blue Origin, et cetera, are based here in the US. They're driving the innovation. They're driving down the cost to get to space. They're building things that just revolutionize life for every American, not just on the national security side. So yeah, long story short, I think it's great.
Yeah, Justin, I think that's.
Oh, you go first, Joe.
Mine will be quick. I think that's a great response. I mean, we've talked about how much SpaceX is going to launch this year, how much it launched in prior years, and I might get this wrong, but I think I looked at it pretty recently that last year was the third year in a row China had more orbital launches than the US. So even though if you took SpaceX out of that question, we'd probably be at a third, maybe a quarter of the number of launches of China. So I think we need to continue to allow SpaceX and Blue Origin to move in their commercial direction, or even if it's just personal ambitions from these founders, they need to be able to move in that direction while operating as government contractors, because we certainly need them in the industrial base.
Joe, did you want to back clean up?
I was just going to say, the way our industrial base operates today is based on clear government demand signals, or ones from government being DoD or Congress that funds DoD, that they respond to. They will literally not do anything else if the government doesn't tell them to do so. Why? Not because they're not patriotic, but it's how their business model is built. So Lockheed's not going to build the F-35 just on its own for kicks and giggles, right? This is a long process that they continually look to the government to fund, and any kind of change results in a change order package that then causes Lockheed in this case, and any contractor, it literally is any contractor, to then work on that specific request. This is why government research and development is at 1.5%. And everyone always complains, oh, DoD or contractors don't spend any money on R&D. Well, they're not supposed to. They're built to respond to what the government asks them to do. This is why what Bezos and Branson, and Elon are doing is so important, because they're building this stuff whether the government asks them to or not. That gives us that awesome resilience that Justin and Joe have been talking about. So I think it's absolutely critical, because otherwise you're only going to have folks building stuff that the government tells them to build. You have no ingenuity, no innovation otherwise.
Yeah, I love this whole discussion, and it feeds into our last question for the day. We're approaching the end of our 45-minute segment. We're actually running a little bit over, ladies and gentlemen, but if you have questions, you can still submit them, and we'll do our best to get you answers directly to those questions. But this idea of being able to have confidence in the government and knowing that what they ask you for, if you actually sally up to it, that they're going to buy it. The F-35 is one of those where you're watching this gray area come back and forth with regard to confidence. And so this question right here is a good one to end with. The Space Force, will the Space Force have a fleet of space vehicles someday, like the Air Force has a fleet of fighters and bombers? Justin, you want to kick that one off?
Absolutely. Short answer is they do today, right? I mean, they've got satellites that they're operating, that they're flying. There's not people in them, but there's scores of satellites up there that the Space Force is responsible for. You've got interesting things like the X-37, demonstrator tech development program, and then Sierra Nevada's out there. They've got their space plane that I don't think the Space Force is buying right now, but I think there's some potentially interesting things down the road. But I think the question I've asked over and over is, the Army has their brigade combat teams, maybe has ships that they count and sort of build their fleet around. How does the Space Force design their fleet, or their force structure, or their force design? And I think there's some interesting answers to that around mission and around orbit, maybe. But short answer is the Space Force is in space today, and they're going to only get stronger up there.
Anything to add, guys? Anything to add?
Yeah, just a quick tag on. I think if we're looking at these assets, what the Space Force could really seek to leverage here, especially with the commercial players, is launch infrastructure. Much like we've got be it ships or bases. The launch infrastructure side is an enormous capital investment that these commercial companies, even if they're majority commercial launches, will seek to avoid. So that could really be a quick and easy way for the Space Force to maintain a tight relationship with these commercial operators.
Fantastic. Steve, anything to add?
No, thank you, JV. It's been great to be a part of this.
I cannot thank you enough. You three are just fabulous, and we'll have you back for more discussions in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time with us this afternoon, or this morning leading about into the afternoon. Grateful for your participation with the questions. We'll do our best to get answers back to you in the days that come. You will have the opportunity to get an email and a survey on this particular panel discussion. We'd love your feedback. If you would be so kind to fill that out and give it back to us. And with that, that's the end of our time together. Steve, Joe, Justin, hats off to you all three. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Thanks, JB.